Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordi,
And I'm Brad.
and welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case, and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it. Except this week, I do. That's right. Time to turn the tables on Jordy and let him not know a damn thing about things for once.
Another Brad episode, you guys, so let's buckle up.
Yeah, I'm trying to step it up. I'm going to try for a little while at least to kind of do an episode every other week for a little while and let Jordy get caught up on things a little bit. I do really enjoy doing cases for you guys, and I really want to help Jordy out. So hopefully you guys are okay with my cases.
Yeah, I know a lot of you guys love it. I love it. I think it's really interesting. We both have very distinct storytelling, case telling, that's a better word, case telling style. So I think it really does also help break up probably the monotony because I have a very monotonous voice. So helps break that up. It's very unique. Both are very interesting and unique. And Brad chooses a lot of interesting cases. So always excited for another Brad episode.
And I was thinking about it today. You can tell Jordy is a crime junkie fan, and you can tell that I'm a Dateline NBC fan just by the way we kind of structure our cases and the way we talk with our cases. I'm a Keith Morrison guy, so I always kind of envision how would Keith Morrison say this when I'm writing a case out. So that's what you'll get more of when you got me.
There you go. I think that's a pretty accurate description. Well, I'm excited to see what this case is. I think that's all we had on the agenda. If you haven't heard about the whole Instagram debacle that we talked about last week, this is being recorded in the past. And so when you guys are hearing this episode, it is the future. So I'm not sure where that whole fiasco will be when this episode actually comes out. But we will keep you updated on the official Instagram. One thing I did notice was last night that apparently the personal chef for, well, at least that's what he had in his bio, the personal chef for Jake Paul and Conor McGregor commented on one of our posts and was like, why am I seeing these types of pages? I thought Donald Trump was going to get rid of y'all. And normally I don't respond, but I did respond and I said, sir, Instagram suggests you profiles and pages to view based off your search history. And then he deleted his comment.
Actually, he didn't delete his comment. I blocked his ass.
Did he? I didn't see it.
100%. I have probably blocked maybe 10 people in 4 years, and I've blocked about 100 today. Yeah, I guess on with the case. I'm kind of it's an interesting thing that is still going on, but I'm also kind of I'm ready for it to die away and just not be viral anymore. I don't want to take it down or anything like that. It does have a lot of positives. One being that it's really getting a lot of followers for this drag performer and everything. But after you just keep seeing this cesspool of comments, you can't help but after a little while for them to kind of get you down, burst your bubble a little bit. I just thought that we were a little bit farther along than we are in people at least trying to respect other people, to be kind to other people. But that is not the case.
And sometimes that's what you got to do. I stopped looking at it because there's only so much. I love arguing with strangers on the internet, but to a point. And then after that, I'm like, I have more important things I need to do. I got podcast episodes to write, research, and on top of everything else. And so there is much better things we can be doing with our time, and that's what we're going to be doing.
Yeah, I don't like drama. I don't like arguing with people. Just go away.
So with that, I'm excited to see, or I guess hear, what case Brad has prepared for us.
And this case isn't like most cases we cover. It is 100% a true queer crime story, but the weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was secrets. Information whispered into the right ears, intelligence traded in the shadows, and betrayals that cost an untold number of lives. But this wasn't just about the human toll. This crime sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government, exposing weaknesses that no one thought possible. It literally, and I mean this, literally threatened the balance of global power, and in the end, left one of the most powerful nations on earth humiliated and scrambling for answers, and asking the same chilling questions. How did this happen? And why? And it all begins with a disappearance.
Ooh, okay, I'm excited. I love secrets. I love conspiracies, which is what this kind of sounds like. I love secret intelligence, the CIA, stuff like that. So I'm excited to see where this is going. I don't know if I actually know this one. I know I've been looking into a similar case actually, so I'm glad we're on the same wavelength, but I don't think I know where Brad's going with this one.
On the morning of May 25th, 1951, British intelligence officers received an urgent report. Two diplomats, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, had vanished. The night before, Burgess, known for his erratic behavior and reckless drinking, had left his London residence with a single suitcase. He was last seen boarding a cross-channel ferry, his destination unknown. MacLean, quieter, more measured, had also slipped away, leaving behind a bewildered wife and a baby son. By the time the authorities pieced together their movements, it was too late. The two men were already behind the Iron Curtain, defecting to the Soviet Union in an audacious move that would expose one of the greatest intelligence failures in British history. In the days following their disappearance, frantic inquiries swept through the corridors of MI5 and MI6. How had two high-ranking officials trusted with Britain's most sensitive secrets defected under their watch? And more importantly, were they acting alone? In whispered conversations behind closed doors, a more chilling possibility took shape. Burgess and MacLean weren't the only traitors. They were part of something larger, a clandestine ring operating undetected for years, feeding British and American intelligence secrets directly to the hands of the Soviet Union. The world would soon come to know them as the Cambridge Five. Their story was unlike any other in the annals of espionage. They were not foreign infiltrators or hired mercenaries, but men of privilege, educated at Cambridge, sons of diplomats, aristocrats, and scholars. Their allegiance to the Soviet Union had been forged not out of coercion, but conviction. Recruited in the 1930s, at a time when fascism was on the rise in Europe, they had sworn loyalty not to Britain, but to the communist ideology they believed would reshape the world. Their betrayal was not merely a breach of security, it was a rupture in the very fabric of British intelligence, exposing a vulnerability that the Western world had failed to anticipate.
So, fun fact, I actually don't think I know anything about this one. And I've actually looked into like cases from around this period. Of course, big one mainly in America with like the Lavender Scare and stuff. But no, I don't think I know anything about the Cambridge Five. So you actually did pull one over on me. I'm always interested to see because this is what I do a lot in my free time is just compile as much as I can. So I'm very excited to hear where this is going because I'm already enthralled, and especially because I have no idea what this is about. And it sounds huge and juicy.
Oh, it's huge.
And juicy.
As the truth unraveled, one name surfaced above all others: Kim Philby, a charismatic and brilliant operative. Philby had risen through the ranks of MI6, earning the trust of colleagues and allies alike. He was the man who had worked side by side with the CIA, the one who had been tasked with hunting down Soviet spies within the British government. And yet, unbeknownst to his closest associates, he had been orchestrating their greatest deception from within. The revelations that followed sent shockwaves through the British establishment. Each new discovery chipped away at the illusion of control, exposing just how deeply Soviet intelligence had infiltrated the very agencies meant to protect national security. For years, the Cambridge Five had operated in plain sight, attending government briefings, sitting on unclassified discussions, and casually passing top secret documents to their Soviet handlers, all while maintaining an unshakable facade of loyalty. By the time the full scope of their betrayal was understood, the damage had already been done. The trust between Britain and its allies, particularly the United States, was irreparably fractured. Sensitive operations had been compromised, agents had been exposed, and Cold War diplomacy had been upended in ways that would take decades to fully comprehend. But even as British intelligence scrambled to contain the fallout, one question remained unanswered. If Burgess and McLean had fled, and Philby was under suspicion, how many more remained? The hunt for the rest of the Cambridge Five had only just begun.
I was about to say, we're up to 3, and it's called the Cambridge Five, so I'm assuming there's at least 2 more. But you never know with names like that.
To understand the betrayal orchestrated by the Cambridge Five, one must understand the world that shaped them. The backdrop was Cambridge University in the 1930s, a place of immense academic prestige where future statesmen and policymakers were molded. But beneath the grandeur of its ancient colleges, the university also was a hotbed of political fervor. The world outside its walls was unraveling. Fascism was spreading across Europe, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, Franco's Spain, each with a grim warning of what unchecked nationalism could bring. The Great Depression had shaken faith in Western capitalism, leaving millions unemployed and disillusioned. Liberal democracy for many appeared weak and ineffectual in the face of these mounting crises. Against this backdrop, communism took on a different meaning. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, positioned itself as the last stronghold against fascism, a nation where class oppression had supposedly been dismantled in favor of a more just society. Within the elite intellectual circles of Cambridge, young students gathered in a clandestine meetings poring over Marxist theory, debating Leninist ideals, and speculating on the future of global politics. Among them, Soviet agents saw an opportunity. Kim Philby, Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross were drawn into the ideological movement not as coerced informants, but as true believers. They were recruited not with money or blackmail, but with conviction. The Soviet Union, they believed, was the only force strong enough to resist the growing tide of fascism. And if their own government refused to take a stand, they would do it themselves from within. The recruiters knew exactly what they were looking for. They were searching for individuals with the right social pedigree to one day reach the upper echelons of government, intelligence, and diplomacy. Cambridge was an ideal hunting ground, consistently producing Britain's future policymakers and intelligence officers. Most of the students were the children of aristocrats or high-ranking officials, men that would inevitably ascend into positions of power. The Soviet plan was calculated, and once the potential students were identified as potential recruits, they were carefully observed. The Soviets didn't try to immediately bring them into the fold, but instead tested their loyalty, often through small acts of ideological commitment. Would they carry messages, pass along minor bits of information, express genuine commitment to the cause? Arnold Deutsch, an NKVD operative working under diplomatic cover, was instrumental in this process. A master manipulator and recruiter, Deutsch understood that these young men weren't common informants. They were long-term investments. He didn't just turn them into spies, he turned them into agents of conviction. He instructed them not to draw attention, not to rush into espionage, but to integrate seamlessly into Britain's institutions. Their orders were clear: rise through the ranks, earn trust, become untouchable. This was not about quick intelligence wins, but about embedding themselves where they could do the most damage over time. When the moment came, when they finally had access to the information Moscow needed, they would already be in place, hidden in plain sight. The Soviets had played the long game, and they played it well.
I was about to say that is a pretty long game to mold someone to rise through the ranks like the Sith Lords and Palpatine. It's kind of what this is reminding me of.
When they say the long game, they were like recruiting from Cambridge because they knew one day these guys are going to be in places of power. And they had set their sights on 5 young men in particular that had exactly the qualities they were looking for. Kim Philby was polished and charming, his natural charisma making him a leader among his peers. Guy Burgess, reckless and brilliant, was well connected within the BBC and the Foreign Office. Donald MacLean, an idealist with a deep intellect, was already marked for a distinguished diplomatic career. Anthony Blunt, an art historian, moved effortlessly between academia and aristocracy. John Cairncross, the least known of the 5, was quiet, but intellectually formidable. At Cambridge, they studied by day and plotted by night. They attended debates, wrote essays, and engaged in the social rituals of Britain's upper class, while quietly forging relationships with their Soviet handlers. They spoke in coded language, operated under assumed names in underground communist circles, and crucially, never allowed their ideological commitment to interfere with their outward personas. To the world, they were ambitious young men destined for greatness. In reality, they were laying the groundwork for one of the most successful espionage operations of the Cold War. As they left university and stepped into government service, they carried with them a dual identity. Trusted members of Britain's intelligence and diplomatic corps, and at the same time, covert agents of the Soviet Union. No one suspected that behind their polished manners and impeccable credentials, they had already pledged their true allegiance elsewhere. The seeds of betrayal had been planted. It would only be a matter of time before they bore fruit. Kim Philby became well positioned within MI6, one of the most trusted members of the British intelligence community. He worked closely with American counterparts, granting him access to unprecedented levels of classified material shared between Britain and the United States. At the height of his career, he was responsible for overseeing anti-Soviet operations, a paradoxical assignment given that he was actively feeding those same plans to Moscow. His charm and intelligence allowed him to maneuver effortlessly through the upper echelons of government, leaving little room for suspicion. Every document he reviewed, every briefing he attended, every operation he helped plan, Moscow knew about it almost immediately. Donald MacLean, a rising star in the Foreign Office, was equally critical to the operation. He had been stationed in Washington during and after World War II, placing him in the perfect position to monitor Anglo-American relations, particularly concerning nuclear policy. His greatest betrayal came in the form of intelligence concerning the Manhattan Project, the top-secret U.S. initiative to develop atomic weapons. While the West assumed the Soviets were far behind in nuclear technology, MacLean's reports ensured that Moscow remained fully aware of the project's advancements. When the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of Western predictions, few realized that it was MacLean's intelligence that had given them the head start.
That's pretty big. That's pretty major, giving countries the access to build atomic bombs. It's definitely scary.
And the Manhattan Project was like one of America's biggest secrets at the time. I mean, that was like...
They built a whole secret city for it.
Yeah, and built the largest building in the world at the time to enrich this uranium, to build these bombs. And honestly, at the time, they didn't even know they were going to work. This was all like a Hail Mary pass that did work.
But it is fascinating just to see how we went from the first atomic bombs being detonated in 1945, and now Russia has its hands on it by 1949, before the end of the decade.
And the thing was, the rest of the world was like, they're so far behind. But everything that MacLean had seen, he just passed it right on to them. So they actually kept up. Basically, the United States and Britain done the work, and Russia was just like, give me them secrets.
They said, our secrets.
Donald MacLean also had another hidden aspect of his life besides his connection to Moscow. While MacLean was outwardly a conventional figure, married with children, and deeply embedded in Britain's diplomatic corps, his personal life was marked by contradictions. He was a bisexual, and this was something they had to keep hidden in an era where such revelations could have destroyed his career and social standing. But even so, MacLean's attraction to men was known within certain circles. MacLean was known for having erratic behavior, particularly in the years leading up to his defection, and in hindsight, his drinking, emotional volatility, and struggles with identity may have contributed to his erratic behavior. And although these outbursts and personal struggles occasionally raised alarms, his privileged background and marriage to Melinda MacLean helped maintain his cover for years. Guy Burgess was openly gay at a time when homosexuality was illegal in Britain. His reckless behavior, heavy drinking, and blatant disregard for discretion should have made him an unlikely spy. Nevertheless, he wielded considerable influence within the British political and media circles. His roles at the BBC and later the Foreign Office allowed him to mingle with diplomats, journalists, and politicians, many of whom freely discuss confidential matters in his presence.
I was about to say, I'm wondering, curious when the queer aspect comes into this case. I figured it was at least one of the Cambridge Five was homosexual. And yeah, that's also interesting, the fact that he was openly gay. And
Yeah.
this is late 1940s, early 1950s in Britain. And very interesting to also see how, I guess, the Soviets were like, it's fine if you're gay if you're helping us.
Just you wait.
Well, maybe I spoke too soon.
His connection to the British elite provided a level of protection, even as his indiscretions raised eyebrows. His sexuality made him an outsider in some ways, but it also gave him access to an underground network of influential, like-minded individuals who operated within the upper echelons of British society. The secrecy that surrounded homosexuality in that era mirrored the nature of espionage, creating an environment where double lives were the norm. Burgess's sexual relationships may have also facilitated his work as a Soviet spy. He was known to befriend and possibly seduce men in positions of influence. There are theories that he used personal relationships to extract sensitive information or manipulate situations in his favor. His flamboyant, chaotic lifestyle made him an unlikely suspect, but also meant he had access to information that he funneled to the Soviet with alarming efficiency. Unlike Philby and MacLean, who maintained a careful facade of professionalism, Burgess was erratic, his drinking and brash behavior often drawing attention, yet for years his connections protected him from serious scrutiny. Anthony Blunt was in many ways the antithesis of Guy Burgess. Blunt's demeanor was one of quiet authority, reserved, meticulous, and deeply embedded within Britain's cultural and intellectual elite. He presented an image of refinement and control that masked his double life as a Soviet spy. As an esteemed art historian and the surveyor of the king's pictures, Blunt moved effortlessly within aristocratic circles, enjoying the trust of British monarchy while secretly betraying his government. His role in MI5 during World War II granted him access to highly classified material, which he passed to his Soviet handlers with calculated precision. His knowledge of British counterintelligence efforts, as well as his advisory position within the royal household, made him an invaluable asset to the KGB. Anthony Blunt was also a gay man. His homosexuality was a defining but discreet aspect of his life, shaping his social circles and in some ways his role within the Cambridge Five. Unlike Guy Burgess, who was openly and flamboyantly gay, despite the legal and social risks, Blunt was far more reserved. He moved within the elite, intellectual, and artistic circles where homosexuality, though still illegal in Britain at the time, was more tolerated behind closed doors. The world of secrecy and coded interactions mirrored the nature of espionage, where maintaining this double life became second nature to him. Blunt's homosexuality may have also played a role in his recruitment into the Soviet intelligence. As a young man at Cambridge, he was drawn to his leftist policies and idealism of communism, a movement that resonated with many of his social and academic circles, particularly those who felt like outsiders in British society, gay people. The Soviet Union, at least in its propaganda, positions itself as a force against fascism and oppression, making it appealing to individuals who felt alienated by Britain's rigid class and moral structures.
That is fair, and that does explain a lot, especially when you try to realize, like, how do Soviet spies in Britain manage to find 5 very high qualified individuals that will rise through the ranks like that? And that's what I was wondering, how you convince them to be this loyal and dedicated. And, based off similar cases we've covered with, gay people, one of my hunches was I'm assuming at least one of them was probably blackmailed for being a homosexual.
No, none of them were blackmailed for being a homosexual. These men believed in what they were going for. They believed in communism. They believed it was the last bastion against fascism. They believed that the Western world was not going to be able to hold out against fascism. The only people that they believed could do it was the Soviet Union because they believed all the propaganda. And, it's one of those things where there's very idealistic views. But, it's kind of like what it says right here. Them being outsiders in some ways makes it also a little bit easier. Like when you don't feel like your own society accepts you, it is a little bit easier to turncoat on them.
That's fair.
John Cairncross was the most elusive and least notorious of the Cambridge Five, a figure who operated in the shadows with a quiet efficiency that set him apart from his more flamboyant counterparts. Unlike Burgess's reckless bravado or Philby's charismatic duplicity, Cairncross was reserved, intellectual, driven by more ideological conviction than personal ambition. His background in literature and language, coupled with his sharp analytical mind, made him an ideal recruit for Soviet intelligence. Cairncross's career placed him in several key positions within the British government, including the Foreign Office, the Treasury, and eventually the code-breaking hub at Bletchley Park during World War II. The code-breaking hub, which you know how important code-breaking was at this time.
I mean, it is what essentially did eventually win World War II, was breaking codes. So, yeah, the fact that the Soviets got someone in there like that is very scary.
I mean, just think you work on all this time to make this elaborate code, and there's someone giving the decoder right to the enemy.
I'd be so pissed.
It was here that he gained access to ultra intelligence, some of the most sensitive wartime secrets derived from decrypted German communications. The information he passed to the Soviets is believed to have been instrumental in aiding the Red Army at the Battle of Kursk, one of the turning points of the war. Unlike his fellow spies, whose espionage often relied on social maneuvering and political connections, Cairncross was a methodical operator, feeding Moscow a steady stream of critical intelligence with little fanfare.
So we've talked about homosexuals during World War II and around this time period in Europe. I honestly didn't know that there's also a gaggle of gays that were kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes and helping pull off some pretty big deals in the war. Battle of Kursk, giving atomic bomb information to Russia.
Like I said at the beginning of this, when I said it literally held the balance of world power in their hands, they truly did.
And it just goes to show you there are bad people from all walks of life. There are good gays and there are bad gays. And bisexuals. I guess one of them is bisexual.
Between the positions of trust and power, along with the intelligence and the connections these 5 men held, the intelligence flow to Moscow was relentless. British counterintelligence efforts, American military strategies, covert operations in Soviet-occupied territories, nothing was beyond their reach. Time and time again, Western plans were compromised before they could even be executed. Agents working against Soviet interests were exposed, forced into exile, or worse, executed. The information funneled to Moscow allowed Stalin's regime to dismantle Western espionage networks with chilling efficiency. Soviet intelligence didn't just react to threats, it anticipated them. As the Cold War escalated, Britain and the United States found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered, unable to explain why their most sensitive operations had failed before they even began. Carefully laid plans were thwarted, Double agents were unmasked before they could report back, and military initiatives were countered with precision. Even at the highest levels of Western leadership, paranoia took hold. Was there a mole, or worse, an entire network of traitors embedded within the very institutions meant to safeguard national security? But secrets can only be stolen for so long before suspicion takes root. By the late 1940s, alarm bells were ringing within the intelligence community. The sheer volume of compromised operations was too great to be dismissed as coincidence. Too many Soviet countermeasures suggested advance warning. Every failure, every inexplicable leak pointed to an unseen hand guiding Moscow's strategy. The Americans, increasingly distrustful, began limiting the intelligence they shared with their British counterparts, wary that their most confidential reports were finding their way into Soviet hands. This rift, once unthinkable between these allies, who had stood together in World War II, signaled the growing realization that the enemy was not just across the Iron Curtain, it was within their own ranks. The search for the source of these betrayals intensified, but the Cambridge Five had spent years perfecting the art of deception. For a time, they remained untouchable, ghosts within the system, feeding Soviet secrets while the West scrambled to uncover the invisible thread unraveling its most guarded operations. By the late 1940s, Western intelligence agencies faced an unsettling reality. Their most sensitive operations were being compromised with alarming precision. Top secret diplomatic cables, military strategies, and nuclear intelligence seemed to be in Soviet hands almost as soon as they were drafted. Every attempt to identify the source of the leak led to dead ends, deepening the suspicion that the breach was not just a single incident, but rather a coordinated and systemic betrayal. The first real breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an obscure code-breaking initiative buried deep within the labyrinth of Cold War intelligence work, the Venona Project, an ambitious effort by American cryptographers to decipher Soviet communications, had been making slow but steady progress. For years, Soviet intelligence agencies had relied on sophisticated encrypted methods, confident in their ability to keep their messages unreadable. But by chance and persistence, U.S. cryptographers had managed to identify patterns within the Soviet transmissions. Each breakthrough was small, a single word, a partial phrase, but when pieced together, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Among the decrypted messages were references to a Soviet source inside the British government. The cables did not reveal a name outright, but they described an individual with access to classified nuclear intelligence, someone who had worked closely with the United States on top-level diplomatic matters. American intelligence officials immediately flagged the information and shared it with Britain's MI5. In London, MI5's counterintelligence division launched a secretive but aggressive internal investigation. They combed through personal records, cross-referencing every official who had handled classified materials with the potential leak. Travel logs were scrutinized, financial transactions were analyzed, and years of diplomatic correspondence reviewed for inconsistencies. The scope of the inquiry was vast, but one name stood out almost immediately: Donald Maclean. Maclean was no ordinary bureaucrat. As a senior diplomat in the British Foreign Office, he had been stationed in Washington, D.C. during World War II, serving as a key liaison between Britain and the United States on nuclear policy. His position granted him access to discussions about the Manhattan Project and post-war atomic strategies, exactly the kind of intelligence the Soviets had managed to obtain. The evidence was circumstantial at first, but there were patterns that couldn't be ignored. Despite the growing suspicion, MI5 knew they needed definitive proof before making a move. A premature accusation could tip off not only Maclean, but any potential co-conspirators working alongside him. They placed him under intense surveillance, tracking his daily movements, intercepting his communications, and monitoring his social circles. Maclean, however, was careful. He rarely engaged in behavior that could arouse immediate suspicion. He was cautious with his correspondence and never openly associated with known Soviet operatives. If he was a Soviet asset, he was disciplined. a fact that made securing hard evidence even more difficult. But McLean wasn't the only name that surfaced during the investigation. As MI5 broadened its scope, another individual came into focus, Guy Burgess. Burgess had been a lone fixture in British intelligence circles, though his erratic behavior, excessive drinking, volatile temper, and indiscreet political views made him an unlikely candidate for espionage. It was undeniable that Burgess had built a formidable network of contacts, and now his close association with McLean seemed more than just a coincidence. Investigators began to suspect that the breach was much larger than they initially believed. The question was no longer whether McLean and Burgess were involved, but whether they were part of a much broader espionage ring operating from within the heart of the British establishment. Yet, as MI5 closed in, the danger of exposure loomed. They knew that if McLean or Burgess caught the wind of the investigation, they might attempt to flee. The clock was ticking, and the challenge was no longer just identifying the spies. It was stopping them before they could disappear into the shadowy depths of the Soviet intelligence network. And although they remained primarily focused on McLean, it was Guy Burgess who would force the final act. Burgess, who had been stationed in Washington, ostensibly as a trusted liaison, but his reckless behavior had begun to draw unwanted attention. Drunken outbursts, flagrant disregard for protocol, and a string of traffic violations, including multiple arrests for speeding while intoxicated, had made him a liability. His superiors, exasperated and eager to avoid further embarrassment, recalled him to London. Burgess, however, saw what others did not. McLean's cover was disintegrating. MI5 was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they made their final move. And if McLean fell, it was likely only a matter of time before the entire network unraveled. There was no time for meticulous planning, no carefully arranged exfiltration route. Their escape was not the work of master spies executing a flawless defection, but an act of desperation. On May 25, 1951, with British intelligence tightening its grip, McLean and Burgess simply vanished. The two men boarded a ferry from Southampton to France, slipping away before MI5 could make an arrest. From there, they moved quickly, disappearing into the vast machinery of the Soviet intelligence apparatus. By the time their absence was discovered, they were gone, vanished behind the Iron Curtain, beyond the reach of British authorities, leaving behind a humiliated intelligence service scrambling to explain how two of their own had managed to outmaneuver them so completely.
The best plan to have is no plan at all, and that kind of makes it hard to predict what people are going to do, especially when you back them into a corner.
Their defection marked the beginning of one of the greatest spy scandals in the 20th century. The British establishment, once so confident in its own security, was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Its most dangerous enemies were not infiltrators from the outside, but its own sons, molded by its own elite institutions, betraying their country not for personal gain, but for a cause they believed in. Of course, this sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. When Burgess and McLean defected, the British government immediately found itself caught in an uncomfortable position. Their sudden disappearance while under constant surveillance suggested that someone within British intelligence had tipped them off, raising the most unsettling question of all. How many more spies were there still, just hiding in plain sight? Their escape was a catastrophe for British counterintelligence, but even worse, it quickly turned into a public relations disaster. The absence of the two men only fueled speculation, but for days there was no official answers. The press speculated wildly, but government officials maintained their silence. Even behind closed doors, there was an air of chaos. How had two highly placed diplomats, both under suspicion, managed to slip away undetected? How much damage had they already done? And if they were truly working for Moscow, what else or who else had been compromised? Worst of all, when this got out to the public, it would be a massive blow to Britain's credibility on the entire world stage. Under normal circumstances, an espionage case of this magnitude would have led to immediate legal action. British law provided clear statutes under the Official Secrets Act that could have been used to prosecute McLean, Burgess, and anyone else implicated in the spy ring. But there was one major problem. The primary suspects were already gone.
Yeah, that's kind of hard to do. Kind of hard to hold someone accountable when they have fled the country.
In the days following their disappearance, authorities had enough circumstantial evidence to build a case, but without arrest, there could be no trial. The British government faced an impossible dilemma. Should they formally accuse the men, acknowledging that high-level diplomats had been Soviet spies for years? Or should they continue to downplay the incident, hoping to avoid further damage to national security and international trust? For months, there was no official confirmation that Burgess and McLean were spies. The government issued vague statements describing their disappearance as unexplained, avoiding any reference to espionage. Behind the scenes, however, MI5 and MI6 were working frantically to contain the fallout. Then, in 1956, the speculation ended. Burgess and McLean reappeared in Moscow, confirming in a press conference that they had defected and were living under Soviet protection. The sight of the two former British officials openly declaring their loyalty to the USSR sent shockwaves through the West. Yet, even with this revelation, no formal charges were brought against them. With both men safely beyond their reach, a prosecution would have been purely symbolic. And in the end, none of the Cambridge Five were ever tried in a courtroom, and they were never formally convicted. However, to the public, their names became synonymous with Cold War treachery. Their betrayal remained an open wound in the history of British intelligence, one that no trial, no sentence, and no verdict could ever truly close.
Now, that is surprising for me because, especially back in this time, I have read cases where, I mean, people were executed for being spies. So the fact that it was this big and none of them even saw charges brought against them is really interesting.
I'm going to explain each one of them.
Perfect.
The closest Britain ever came to prosecuting one of the Cambridge Five was in the case of Kim Philby. In the mid-1950s, Philby was under growing suspicion. He had been identified as the likely third man who had warned Burgess and McLean of their impending exposure, allowing them to escape just in time. But proving his guilt was another matter entirely. MI5 questioned Philby multiple times, but his charm, connections, and careful denials kept him from facing any formal charges. He had friends in high places, both within the British government and among journalists who publicly defended him. Lacking definitive proof, officials could not risk a trial that might end in an acquittal, further embarrassing the intelligence community. So a lot of this is going to be, we just don't want to be embarrassed again.
And that's fair. You'll see that a lot through history with all kinds of cases, not even just spy cases, but if the DA or the public, the government thinks they're going to look like fools at the end of this, they will happily let a criminal go because public perception is everything.
Philby was quietly pushed out of MI6 in 1955. For nearly a decade, he lived a shadowy existence, working as a journalist in Beirut, while British intelligence continued to keep an eye on him. Then, in 1963, when the weight of the new evidence became overwhelming, Philby made his move. He defected to the Soviet Union, escaping justice, just as Burgess and McLean had done before him. Perhaps the most startling revelation in the unraveling of the last member of the Cambridge Five was not just that another Soviet spy had been exposed, but that British officials had known about him for years and chosen to keep it quiet.
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, there's always got to be a good plot twist. This was reading like a movie. A good spy thriller. Love a good spy thriller. So they always got to throw that one twist in right at the end.
Anthony Blunt, the distinguished art historian and former surveyor of the Queen's pictures, was unmasked as a Soviet agent in 1964. Yet, instead of facing prosecution or public disgrace, he was granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. The British government, wary of yet another high-profile scandal that could further damage its credibility, kept his betrayal classified for 15 years. Blunt continued his career, moving through elite circles with his secret intact, shielded by the very establishment that he had once betrayed. When the truth finally emerged in 1979, it raised deeply unsettling questions. If Blunt had been protected for so long, Who else might have been? Had other Soviet operatives within the British establishment been quietly identified and shielded from exposure, not just to protect national security, but to preserve the reputation of Britain's ruling class? The Blunt affair underscored the deep reluctance of British authorities to fully confront the extent of the Soviet infiltration. Even when his name was finally revealed to the public, the secrecy surrounding his case fueled speculation that other spies may have remained undetected, or worse, had been deliberately hidden from scrutiny. This helped fuel the speculation that the Cambridge Five were not alone, that a sixth man may have existed within the British establishment, someone who either remained undiscovered or was quietly shielded from exposure. The idea was not without merit. The reach of the Cambridge Five was vast, and their ability to operate undetected for decades suggests a deeper network of influence. Some intelligence analysts believe that the extent of the Soviet penetration into British intelligence cannot fully be explained by the actions of just 5 men. The Cambridge spies provided Moscow with an unprecedented flow of classified information, including nuclear secrets, military strategies, and highly sensitive diplomatic communications. Their success was, in part, a failure of British counterintelligence, a failure that might have been enabled by yet another Soviet mole operating within the shadows. In 1981, historian and former KGB officer Oleg Gordeski, who later defected to the West, suggested that British intelligence was aware of an additional Soviet spies and that had deliberately chosen not to expose them, either due to lack of solid proof or to avoid further humiliation. Though no definitive evidence has surfaced, whispers of a sixth man continue to persist, leaving an open-ended mystery in the Cambridge Five saga.
I was about to say, that's a good mystery, either it be a movie or a TV show or a book. It always leaves you wanting more.
And do you know who actually outed him finally? Told everyone that he was a spy after he had been hidden all those years?
Who?
Margaret Thatcher.
Good old Margaret Thatcher.
She didn't put up with nobody's shit, including her own government. She was like, this man's a spy. Get his ass out of here.
Loved her when she was played by Meryl Streep, and loved her when she was played by Jillian. Oh my God, I'm going to get so much crap. Scully from The X-Files and The Crown.
Anderson?
Yeah, Gillian Anderson. I was going to say Anderson. I'm pretty positive it's Anderson.
Gillian Anderson.
I'm going to Google that real quick because I'm not going to be embarrassed on our own podcast.
Was it Gillian Anderson?
It was Gillian Anderson. Okay, so I don't feel like I'm crazy. But yes, Margaret Thatcher is very infamous, very famous.
What was her nickname?
I was about to say,
Iron, was it like the...
I'm pretty sure her nickname was... And also she was played marvelously in Snatch Game by Bag of Chips. The Iron Lady, yes. The Iron Lady. Because that was the name of the movie Meryl Streep was in, based off her life.
One of the most haunting questions surrounding the Cambridge Five is the full extent of the damage they caused. Official records released over the years have provided glimpses into their betrayals, but the complete story remains classified in both British and Russian archives. During their time as Soviet assets, the Cambridge spies compromised countless intelligence operations, exposed Western agents, and provided the KGB with insights into the highest levels of British and American strategy. Some of the most significant Cold War failures, botched operations, exposed informants, and intelligence gaps have been indirectly linked to the Cambridge network. One of the most devastating consequences of their espionage was the loss of British and American agents behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets, armed with information provided by the Cambridge Five, were able to dismantle Western spy networks in Eastern Europe, leading to the arrests, imprisonment, and execution of double agents working for the West. The true number of lives lost as the result of the betrayal remains unknown to this day.
So I was about to say, yeah, people did die from this. I'm sure countless people died from this.
I mean, probably more people than you can ever, because also all of these botched operations that are going on, people are dying during these things too. This is kind of like a history lesson, but it's also definitely a true crime case because these men led to the demise of countless people. And they almost changed the world as we know it today. Like, they came very close. I mean, when you hand over nuclear power to someone, you can change the whole current of the world.
Well, yeah, when you give a country access to atomic bombs, yeah, you have reshaped the course of history there.
Even decades later, intelligence agencies remain tight-lipped about certain aspects of the case. Files related to the Cambridge Five are still heavily redacted, and some documents remain sealed under national security laws. While much of the Western intelligence community's knowledge of the Cambridge Five comes from declassified documents and defectors' testimonies, one crucial source remains largely inaccessible: the KGB archives. To this day, Russia has not fully disclosed its files of the Cambridge Five. Some historians believe that those records contain details that could reshape the story, potentially confirming the existence of additional spies, revealing new intelligence losses, or shedding light on how deeply the Soviet Union had infiltrated Britain's security establishment. Former KGB officials who have spoken on the matter have provided only partial insights, often hinting at secrets still locked away. The Kremlin's continued silence suggests that some details of the Cambridge Five's work remain sensitive, even decades after the Cold War had ended. So, what were the final fates of the Cambridge Five? And were their betrayals worth the price they paid for the fallout? After Kim Philby defected to Moscow, he was lauded as a hero by the Soviets and awarded the Order of Lenin. Yet, he was never fully trusted. The KGB kept him under constant surveillance, fearing he might still be working for British intelligence. Though he was given a role advising the KGB, his attempts to train new Soviet spies were reportedly unimpressive. He turned to alcohol, possibly out of disillusionment and loneliness. His third wife left him, and despite public honors, he privately expressed regret about his choices. He died in Moscow in 1988, a man caught between two worlds, yet fully trusted by neither of them. Donald MacLean fled to the Soviet Union in 1951 alongside Burgess. He adapted better than the others to life in Moscow, taking the name Mark Petrovich and securing a high-ranking position in Soviet foreign policy institutions. He remained committed to communism, but the transition was not without struggles. Over time, he battled depression and alcoholism. His wife and children eventually joined him in Moscow, though his wife later returned to the West. While he was treated better than the others, he was still an outsider to the Soviet system. He died in 1983, his ideological commitment intact, but his personal life fractured. Guy Burgess found being openly gay and flamboyant in the Soviet Union particularly bleak. Go figure.
I was about to say, well, what a surprise.
Surprise, surprise. In London, his homosexuality had been tolerated within espionage and bohemian circles, but the Soviet Union was far more repressive. Stalinist policies criminalized homosexuality, seeing it as a sign of Western corruption. And the conservative Soviet society did not accept his flamboyant personality. Unlike MacLean, he was not given a prestigious role in Soviet intelligence. Instead, he was monitored by the KGB, kept under control, but not trusted. He quickly fell into despair, drinking heavily and expressing a deep longing to return to Britain. Reports suggest he begged the Soviet officials to allow him to go back, but his requests were denied. He died in 1963, likely from complications related to alcoholism, his once vibrant social life reduced to isolation in Moscow.
You know what they say, the grass is always greener.
But I'm going to be a homo in
Soviet Russia. I mean, sometimes, and this is a college-educated Cambridge man, sometimes you got to just use your common sense.
Anthony Blunt managed to evade exposure the longest. A respected art historian, he was even knighted in 1956. In 1964, he secretly confessed to being a Soviet spy in exchange for immunity. For years, he continued his career, but in 1979, Margaret Thatcher publicly exposed him.
Good old Margie T, baby.
She stripped away his knighthood and shunned by society and became a pariah. Though Britain had decriminalized homosexuality by this time, Deep-seated homophobia remained, and his sexuality was frequently used to paint him as untrustworthy. While some accused him of being susceptible to blackmail, there is no evidence that his espionage was linked to coercion over his sexuality. He lived the remainder of his years in isolation, his reputation ruined, dying in 1983. John Cairncross, the least publicly known of the spy ring, though exposed in the 1960s, he denied being part of the Cambridge Five and largely avoided the public scandal that engulfed the others. He worked as a translator and later moved to France, where he lived a quiet life. Initially seen as the least damaging of the group, declassified documents later revealed that he had passed significant intelligence to the Soviets. He died in 1995, largely forgotten compared to the more infamous members of the ring.
I guess he probably got the best of it. And keep your head down and deny.
So with that, the case of the Cambridge Five is, in many ways, a closed chapter in the history of espionage. The key players are gone, the Cold War is over, and the world has moved into a new era of intelligence warfare. And yet, the questions that remain about the full extent of the betrayal, the lives lost because of their actions, and the possibility of additional spies ensure the story is never truly over. The truth, buried in classified files and Cold War secrecy, may never fully be uncovered. But as long as questions remain, the legacy of the Cambridge Five will continue to haunt the world of intelligence. A reminder that even the most trusted individuals can betray, and that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to stay hidden forever. In the end, the Cambridge Five were not just spies. They were symbols of a much larger struggle between loyalty and ideology, secrecy and exposure, power and vulnerability. Their story remains unfinished, a reminder that espionage is not just about stolen documents and coded messages, but about the human motivations that drive individuals to betray, deceive, and ultimately redefine the course of history.
And that was a wild roller coaster of a ride. That was a really good episode. And a really good history lesson. And yeah, snaps for Brad. That was really well researched. I think that's the longest episode we've ever done. Very thorough research. That was fascinating.
Holy crap. That was an hour and 20 minutes long.
Yeah, that's an hour and 20 minutes. At first, I thought around the 45-minute mark because I can see the scroll wheel, and we were about maybe a third of the way down. I was like, oh, this bastard's going to try to jump a two-parter on me. And he kept going. So I was like, all right, we are going to have a jam-packed episode, which I love. No, this was a really good episode. There was a lot of information to get through. It was really good information. And this is a really well done episode. So
yeah, I fell
snaps
down the
to Brad.
rabbit hole on this one, and I've just found it like super interesting. I kind of like started with the idea of like famous gay spies, and just so happened that they happen to be the bad guys.
No, this is actually a really fascinating case that I don't know that much about either. So I'm curious to know if there's a book about it. If there is, I'm going to read it. And I'm also curious to know if this has been made into a movie or a TV show yet, because if not, I can very well see Ron Murphy somehow getting his grubby little hands on this and turning it into one of his million Netflix shows. So somebody get on that if it's not already a show. And if it is, I know what we're binge watching this weekend.
And if you need anybody to give you references, I read a lot about it.
But yeah, that's such a fascinating story. And also just fascinating, like I said, how it was several homosexuals that were pulling the strings to get Russia schematics essentially to atomic bombs. So, queer history runs deep. It has roots in many facets of life, some very, well known, and some not so well known, like case in point. So this is a really good queer history episode, and I'm glad we're throwing all this history at you guys. There's so many new listeners and so many of you that love to hear all this queer history, so I'm glad we're just throwing it at you week after week.
And this was truly a true crime case because, like I said, these men were responsible for countless numbers of lives lost.
No, it very much is a true crime case.
And I mean, being a spy is criminal act.
Punishable by execution.
Yeah.
I don't think people understand sometimes how serious it is. It's like, oh, they just gave some secrets away. It's like, no, that will get your head lopped off, and it will be about as close to a public execution as humanely as possible.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if you know a secret, what's the best way to keep that secret covered?
It's like Pretty Little Liars always said, only two can keep a secret if one of them is dead. And that's how it goes. So, watch who you tell secrets to. And with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in for another episode. This was a really good episode. And thank you, Brad, for doing another very well-researched, very well-told episode. I loved it. I loved hearing about this case because, like I said, I've never heard about it before. If you enjoyed this episode and the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot. Helps other people discover the podcast. And, of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod. That's POD. Or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next week, I'm going to go Google these guys to see what they look like because I have images of them in my head and I want to see if they match what I'm thinking about. And until then, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.